Thank you. Representative LaHood.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of you for being here today and your service. Ambassador Emanuel, welcome. You had many accomplishments as ambassador to Japan. I want to highlight one of those was the Chicago Cubs opening their season in Japan this year with a 3-game series. So I think you had something to do with that. So thank you for that and bringing the Cubs to Japan. Ambassador Emanuel, I think what many of us appreciated in your service in Japan was your bluntness, your honesty, and your straightforwardness. And I want to read from an article from September 20th of 2023 from NBC News. The title, White House told U.S. Ambassador to Japan to stop taunting the Chinese on social media. Rahm Emanuel has mocked Chinese President Xi Jinping, speculating about the recent disappearance of a top official. And then you went on social media with the hashtag mystery in Beijing building. And my question is, that was strategic and that was tactical. And I think many of us appreciated you taking them on. What was achieved by that and what were the ramifications?
I think since we know each other pretty well, one, there was never an effort to really silence me, but even if there was, it didn't succeed, as you know. And the effort was to show, as like in the situation, when I bring up the situation in Fukushima, and I want to compliment the Aquilino, who was head of the Indo-PACOM at that time, because he had resources, and we caught pictures of the Chinese fishing boats in Japanese waters. That picture told 1,000 words. It was part of a campaign over a period of time that paid dividends because China threw in the towel at the end. So part of this was also to show the hypocrisy of what China was doing. And there was a minister of defense, there was a foreign minister, and there was basically 3 or 4 cabinet ministers who went missing and never heard from again in 3 or 4 times. I think I cited Agatha Christie, and then there were none, was actually the social media at that point. So it was to show the hypocrisy of China, also to show the fact that what they were doing and basically lift the curtain on that kind of actions in that area. It didn't stop because, as you could see pretty recently, I've lost count, I think 4 to 5 members of the People's Liberation Army, their armed forces, the commanders and leaders of that forces, have all now been fired, et cetera, in that effort. So it was to expose the hypocrisy of their political acts and what they said. They always, and I think the Prime Minister knows this, they always say it's win-win.
Yeah.
But all roads lead to one destiny, Beijing's advantage.
Yeah, thank you for that. In your response to Mr. Torres's questions, you talked a little bit about partnering with our like-minded allies. I came a little late, but we haven't heard TPP. Now, that's in the past. But when we think about TPP and what we wanted to do there, in terms of writing the rules of the road when it comes to trade in the Indo-Pacific region, partnering with our like-minded allies. Now, that ship has probably passed, but that seemed to me what you were referring to in terms of how do we work with, on the economic front, how do we partner with our allies there to do that? Is that still a strategy you think has legs?
I don't think you should, if I could, Mr. Congressman, don't isolate it by region. One of the success of the past strategy, in my view, was that Europe realized that it was not North Atlantic over here and the Indo-Pacific over here. There was one strategic sphere. You want Europe engaged economically, politically, in the peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific. That gives us greater leverage. You don't want this just on Australia, Japan, and South Korea. You want all our friends involved and pulling in the same direction. Now, I think, as the G7 communique indicated, as EU's action after Lithuania was isolated, you want countries of like-minded interests to come together, form an economic union where anti-coercion is at the core of confrontation. It flips the script where China's trying to isolate an Australia or trying to isolate a Japan. They become the isolated party. You want the economic coercion quiver to be taken out so they don't rely on it. And remember, if you take all the countries we talked about in the Indo-Pacific, you take the United States, Canada, Mexico, the EU, they cannot export their capabilities just to the developing world. It's just not that big of a market today. The other thing I would say to you, it also then goes through a vulnerability. Half the cases at the World Trade Organizations are brought by other countries against Chinese companies doing exactly what the Prime Minister said, crushing price to destroy competition. You saw it in the steel plant in Chile, 20,000 people laid off. South Africa, an ally of China, brought a case. Brazil, an ally, brought a case, all in the steel aluminum area. So by pulling these markets back and uniting them as allies and friends, we'll have our disagreements, but we're united in our confrontation on China. You make China's attempt to crush other countries' manufacturing and industrial capacity a vulnerability of theirs. Because right now, China can be the target of public ire and anger, rather than, in the situation, the United States. Flip the script.
Thank you for that. Mr. Morrison, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I do. I want to agree with what the ambassador said, but
I think that's enough.
but I would also want to highlight the issue that you've raised in your question. Particularly in Southeast Asia and with the Indo-Pacific more broadly, many of our aligned friends, the idea that we would ask them to make a choice in this strategic rivalry is unwise. There are nations in the Indo-Pacific of which that's entirely appropriate, and Australia is one of those as a core ally of the United States. But other countries in the region want choice. And so where China is active in a particular country, well, that will happen. The response to that is not for US or other allied interests to not be there. The response is to double down and be there even more strongly and to provide them with that choice. And I observe this with many countries in Southeast Asia. They would not only want to see us, but they would want to see our pension funds. They would want to see our companies, and they particularly want to see those coming out of the United States. Companies like Mitsubishi are very active in Indonesia and so on. This is a good and positive thing because in many of these Southeast Asian countries, economic security is security. It is their primary issue. And so while we can speak as allies of our shared values around the issues that are most important to us, they will not always completely overlap. And we must prioritise the economic relationship with these countries to give them assurance and confidence so they can become like-minded partners on particular things. And by the way, for the TPP, the door's always open, they're always welcome, and we should never allow the PRC into it, certainly if the US is not into it, and the first one that should be coming in should be Taiwan.
Thank you.